Good afternoon, my friends. On a bright afternoon in Johannesburg, a single voice rises inside the hall of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. No drums, no shouts, just the weight of truth pressing on the air. The speaker begins not with statistics, but with gratitude. Gratitude to a man who once stepped out of prison carrying a whole continent's hope in his hands. Nelson Mandela taught the world that freedom cannot be divided, that the dignity of one people depends on the dignity of all. And now, decades later, standing on that same African soil, another struggle echoes from afar, the struggle of Palestine. The crowd listens as the words grow heavier. When we wash our hands of others' pain, we are less than human. Images of Gaza flicker in the mind, families searching for children beneath rubble, olive trees burning in the West Bank, water running dry. The voice trembles not with fear, but with remembrance. Justice, he says, is not a dream. It's a duty. From South Africa's long road to freedom to Burkina Faso's new awakening under President Ibrahim Traoré, a question burns quietly through the hall. How long will the world pretend that some lives matter more than others? Because justice, like freedom, is indivisible. And if Palestine still bleeds, if Africa is still denied its full sovereignty, then humanity itself remains unfinished. So, my brothers and sisters, if you still believe that truth must travel, even when it's banned, stay with me. If you believe that the spirit of Mandela lives on in every leader who dares to defy empire in Gaza, in Ouagadougou, in your own heart, then listen till the end. Because what follows may remind us all that Africa still holds the moral compass of our time. The hall grows quiet as the voice deepens. The man at the podium lifts his eyes toward the crowd and says softly, to invoke Mandela's name is not to canonize him, but to awaken his unfinished struggle within each of us. From that moment, the lecture ceases to be a ceremony. It becomes a reckoning. The speaker reminds everyone that when Mandela walked out of prison, he did more than free himself. He rewrote the grammar of power. He transformed domination into dignity and showed that the fight for freedom is never the burden of one people alone. But now, decades later, freedom is bleeding again. And this time, it bleeds in Gaza. The speaker's tone sharpens, trembling between grief and fury. 2 years after the beginning of the genocide, he says Gaza has become a wasteland of rubble, refuse, and human remains. He lists the numbers slowly, not for shock, but for remembrance: over 240,000 killed or injured, entire neighborhoods, erased children pulled from dust, water, scarce medicine gone, electricity fading, families displaced again and again with nowhere left to go. His words are not abstract, they are surgical. This is not a war, he insists, it is a design. A system of destruction, systematic, deliberate, and profitable. He calls it an economy of occupation. Because behind every bomb, there's a contract. Behind every demolished home, there's a construction firm waiting to rebuild for a price. Behind every image of despair, there are stocks soaring on the Tel Aviv exchange. While Gaza starved, he says the market gained over $200 billion. The audience stirs. Some shake their heads. Others wipe tears. The man pauses and looks around. This is not chaos, it's commerce. Then he makes the connection few dare to speak aloud. The suffering of the Palestinians, he says, mirrors the long agony of colonized peoples everywhere, the same chain of power, the same excuses, the same selective blindness. And that is why he chose to speak here in South Africa, the land that once dismantled apartheid yet still carries its scars. Because from the streets of Johannesburg to the refugee camps of Gaza, there runs a single thread: the struggle for dignity. The speech moves beyond geography. Palestine's pain, he continues, is not isolated. It belongs to the world's majority, to those still rebuilding from the wreckage of empire. He calls them the global south, or as he prefers, the global majority. And in his voice, there is both anger and awe: anger at hypocrisy, awe at resilience. He turns to the crowd and names the truth that many fear: genocide, he says, is the dormant gene of any system built on supremacy. But then he adds, almost whispering, and yet within that darkness, people still plant olive trees. At that sentence, the hall falls silent again. It's no longer about numbers or politics. It's about endurance, the quiet defiance of mothers, farmers, and children who refuse to surrender their humanity. And just when the heaviness feels too much to bear, the speaker shifts his gaze to the future, to the continent beneath his feet. Africa, he says, has known centuries of wounds, yet she still nourishes life. He mentions Burkina Faso, calling it the beating heart of Africa's awakening, where a young generation led by President Ibrahim Traoré is proving that sovereignty is not a slogan, but a lived reality. When a people, no matter how poor, claim their right to stand tall, they speak the same language as Mandela, the same as Gaza, the same as every soul that refuses to kneel. The hall erupts in applause, not for him, but for the spirit of resistance that refuses to die. The air in the room thickens as the speech turns from mourning to confrontation. The voice that once trembled with grief now carries the edge of command. This is a textbook case of genocide, he declares, not a conflict, not a tragedy. A deliberate, systematic annihilation executed with precision and financed with impunity. The crowd gasps, then erupts into applause that feels less like celebration and more like release. For 2 years, the speaker explains Israel has waged war on a civilian population with no army, no air force, no refuge. This, he says, is not self-defense. It's domination, colonial in design, economic in nature, and racial in execution. He pauses. But what's happening in Gaza is not only about Gaza. Behind those words lies the real revelation, the unmasking of a global order that profits from suffering. Genocide, he says, is not only the destruction of a people, it is the exposure of a system that calls itself civilized, while living off blood and ruin. Then his voice softens, almost as if confessing, yet even amid the ashes, Palestine remains the stubborn heartbeat of a region fighting for its soul. The hall grows still again. And then the pivot. He turns toward the government of South Africa, calling them by name, when South Africa brought Gaza before the International Court of Justice, while others looked away, you did not. You proved again who you are, heirs of Nelson Mandela. The applause this time is thunderous. The audience rises to its feet. Cameras flash. For a moment, the ghosts of Robben Island seem to fill the room. He continues, voice rising over the cheers. This was not merely a legal act. It was a moral earthquake, the first settler colonial genocide ever brought before an international court. And through that act, South Africa restored faith in international law. Then the challenge, but law, is only as strong as the courage of nations to enforce it. He lists what justice demands: the withdrawal of troops, the dismantling of illegal colonies, the return of stolen land and resources, reparations to victims, and the sacred right of return for refugees. Each word lands like a verdict. Then comes the harder truth. The United States banned me, he says quietly, because truth has no visa in Washington. The crowd murmurs. He lifts his hand. But here in Africa, truth still has a home. He calls for action not just from governments, but from the people. Justice begins in our choices, in what we buy, in what we refuse to tolerate. He urges universities to divest from companies tied to Israel's military supply chains. He demands that banks stop underwriting war bonds. He calls on unions to strike because if workers stopped for 1 month, the bombing would stop too. And then, almost in a whisper that pierces through the applause, he names a prisoner, Marwan Barghouti. The hall roars. He is not forgotten. Free him. The speaker pleads, for his voice has been silenced too long. As the sound swells, he steadies himself and repeats Mandela's warning from 1997, having achieved our own freedom, we would be less than human if we wash our hands of the struggles of others. Those words hang in the air like judgment, not just against nations, but against every bystander who claims neutrality while the world burns. The tone softens again, shifting from accusation to invitation. The struggle of Gaza is not a cry of victimhood, he says. It's a mirror. And in that mirror, we see ourselves, our silence, our complicity, our choices. He looks out over the crowd, students, veterans, mothers, journalists, diplomats, and asks quietly, will we wash our hands or will we lift them? A pause. Then he nods slowly as if answering his own question. Because neutrality in the face of injustice is not peace, it's surrender. And from that silence, the crowd rises once more, not to applaud a man, but to affirm a truth that can no longer be unseen. When the applause faded, the world outside the auditorium was already moving. Within hours, fragments of the speech began spreading online, translated, quoted, dissected, debated. In universities from London to São Paulo, students gathered for vigils. Across the streets of Paris, Johannesburg, and New York, banners appeared overnight. We wanted to save Palestine, but Palestine is saving us. The message was no longer confined to Gaza. It had become a mirror of global conscience. In legal circles, the speech intensified pressure on international institutions. Jurists in The Hague echoed the call for enforcement: withdraw troops, dismantle settlements, return what was stolen. South Africa's case before the International Court of Justice now looked less like an isolated act and more like a moral benchmark. Nations across Latin America, Asia, and Africa began signaling their support. Namibia and Bolivia endorsed the filing. Kenya and Senegal debated following suit. For the first time in decades, the Global South was speaking with one legal voice. Meanwhile, Western capitals fell into uneasy silence. Washington dismissed the allegations, Brussels called for balance. But millions of ordinary citizens, especially older generations who once marched against apartheid, recognized the pattern. They had seen this play before, just with different victims. In the streets, the response was visceral. Unions began reviewing their pension funds. Professors resigned from research programs linked to Israeli defense contracts. Churches reopened old committees once used to fight apartheid. From Cape Town to Chicago, boycotts resurfaced as instruments of conscience. And for many who had felt powerless for years, this return to organized dissent felt like oxygen. The speaker had said justice begins in our choices. People took him literally. Supermarket shelves changed. Consumer apps lit up with boycott lists. Art exhibitions turned into teach-ins. And for the first time since the Iraq War, a shared sense of moral purpose crossed oceans. But nowhere did the echo sound deeper than across Africa itself. In Burkina Faso, young people gathered in Ouagadougou's Revolution Square, replaying the South African speech through loudspeakers. They saw in it the same defiance that President Ibrahim Traoré had voiced when he told his nation, "Sovereignty is not a gift. It is a responsibility we must defend." Editorials compared South Africa's legal courage with Burkina Faso's economic sovereignty, two sides of the same awakening. One fought for justice in court, the other built justice on the ground through land reform, gold nationalization, and the refusal to submit to foreign dictates. In that moment, the continent's two moral frontiers, Pretoria and Ouagadougou, seemed to align. The law and the people side by side, confronting the same invisible empire of fear and finance. Internationally, the speech fractured old alliances. Some Western NGOs withdrew funding from South African partners, others doubled their support. The European Parliament called an emergency debate. The U.S. Congress held hearings about anti-Israeli sentiment in Africa, yet the backlash only strengthened the resolve of those who saw in this crisis an opportunity to redefine global ethics. By the week's end, South Africa's foreign minister received messages from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso proposing a Pan-African legal coalition, a forum that would collectively challenge illegal occupations, resource theft, and external interference. What began as a lecture had become a movement, and somewhere in Ouagadougou, a woman sweeping her doorstep after evening prayers whispered to her neighbor, "Maybe Africa is learning to breathe together again." Across the ocean, the reaction in the United States was instant and conflicted. Cable networks cut the speech into fragments, one channel calling it anti-Western rhetoric, another describing it as the most uncomfortable truth since Vietnam. But for millions of ordinary Americans watching online, the message struck a deeper chord. They saw echoes of their own contradictions, a nation that once marched for civil rights, now struggling to recognize the same cry for justice when it comes from Gaza. Talk shows debated whether South Africa had gone too far by bringing Israel to the International Court of Justice. Commentators on both sides of the aisle argued that international law had no place in realpolitik. Yet beneath the noise, older Americans, veterans, churchgoers, retired, teachers began writing letters, joining small vigils, asking one another why the same moral clarity that once opposed apartheid now seemed to vanish. One retired Marine from Detroit told a reporter, "I fought for democracy, not for silence." His words went viral. In just days, small-town newspapers across the Midwest were publishing editorials titled, "Have We Become What We Once Fought Against?" Meanwhile, universities across Europe experienced their own reckoning. In Paris, students occupied lecture halls demanding divestment. In London, thousands marched behind a banner that read, "If South Africa can stand up, why can't we?" The contrast was unmistakable. The so-called global north appeared morally exhausted, while the global south from Pretoria to Ouagadougou seemed newly alive. As Western leaders wavered, Africa spoke with clarity. Namfai defended law, Burkina Faso embodied sovereignty. Both were rewriting the idea of leadership not through wealth or weapons, but through principle. In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré's government expressed support for South Africa's case, calling it a step toward the world Mandela envisioned, a world where law serves humanity, not empire. Commentators began referring to this new alignment as the axis of moral independence. Analysts in Washington quietly admitted what few dared say aloud: Africa was no longer the passive subject of global affairs. It had become the conscience of the world. The speaker's words, "Truth has no visa in Washington," became a viral meme echoing across late-night talk shows. Activists projected it onto buildings in New York and Los Angeles. But beyond the humor lay discomfort. America's claim to moral leadership was being tested by a continent it once lectured on democracy. When sanctions and media bans tried to silence African voices, they only amplified them. Online, the hashtags #HowInjustice has no visa and Knock Africa Leads trended for days. And in a rare editorial, The Guardian concluded, it is no longer Africa seeking recognition from the world. It is the world now seeking moral recognition from Africa. By the end of that week, it became clear that a new dialogue had begun. Not East versus West, not North versus South, but empire versus conscience. The United States still held the power of the dollar and the drone. Yet Africa, with its history of survival, its leaders like Mandela and Traore, held something far more enduring: legitimacy born from pain. When power loses its soul, the speaker had said, only those who have suffered can remind it of what it means to be human. And for the first time in decades, the world seemed ready to listen. As the applause faded and the lights dimmed, the hall in Johannesburg seemed to breathe again, heavy but alive. What had just unfolded was more than a lecture. It was a warning. Alone, we are frail, the speaker had said. But when we flap our little wings together, we can make a storm. May justice be our storm. Those words still echo tonight across oceans and timelines. They remind us that injustice does not die, it migrates. It changes form, it changes color, but it feeds on silence. From the prisons of Gaza to the gold fields of Africa, the same hands that profit from suffering are still at work. And yet so are the hearts that resist. In South Africa, the law stood up. In Burkina Faso, the people stood up. And perhaps that is the message for all of us, that moral power is not granted by institutions, but earned through courage. Look at Burkina Faso today. A small nation dismissed by the powerful, now rewriting its destiny under President Ibrahim Traoré, reclaiming gold mines from foreign companies, building its own roads, teaching its own children to believe in themselves. He may not speak in grand halls like this one, but his message is the same: freedom must be practiced, not preached. From Mandela's South Africa to Traoré's Burkina Faso, a bridge is forming, built not from wealth or weapons, but from conviction. A bridge that says justice is not Western, it is human. But will we cross it? Will we, who live in comfort and peace, dare to lift our voices when others are silenced? Will we demand of our governments and of ourselves that we stop funding destruction in the name of diplomacy? Or will we, as Mandela warned, wash our hands and call it balance? The answer lies not in politics, but in conscience. Because history will not remember our debates. It will remember our silence or our courage. So my brothers and sisters watching from afar in Chicago, in Atlanta, in Dallas, if you believe that truth is not a crime, if you believe that a small nation like Burkina Faso can still teach the world what sovereignty means, then do not turn away. Share this message if you believe Africa is reclaiming its voice. Subscribe if you believe that justice is not a privilege, it's a duty. And tell us in the comments, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's vision of sovereignty could be the next chapter in Mandela's unfinished dream? Because the world is shifting, and this time Africa is not following, it is leading.